At 2:15 in the morning, my water broke across our bedroom floor. I shook Brian awake and told him our son was coming. He pulled the blanket over his shoulder and said, "I have a 9 o'clock presentation. Call an ambulance." For a few seconds, I honestly thought I had misheard him. The room was dark except for the blue light from his phone charging on the nightstand. The air conditioner hummed softly. Somewhere outside, a sprinkler clicked across a neighbor's lawn. And there I was, standing beside the bed in a damp nightgown, one hand braced against my lower back, staring at the man I had been married to for 12 years. "Brian," I said again, "my water broke." He opened one eye. "Claire, I heard you." Another contraction tightened across my stomach. I grabbed the dresser until it passed. "You need to take me to the hospital." He rubbed both hands over his face like I had woken him over a leaking faucet. "I have been working on this presentation for 3 weeks. It's the St. Vincent account. If I walk in there half asleep, I could lose the whole region." I remember looking at him and thinking how strange it was that he could say all that while I was standing in a puddle. "I'm scared," I said. That should have mattered. Instead, he sighed. "You've had months to prepare for this. Call 911 if you need to." Then he rolled over. He actually rolled over. I wish I could tell you I screamed at him. I didn't. I stood there listening to his breathing settle again while another contraction started. My name is Claire Morgan. At the time, I was 44 years old and worked as the librarian at Town Meadow Elementary in Carmel, Indiana. I had spent most of my adult life keeping things in order. Books in the right section. Permission slips in labeled folders. Winter reading lists printed before Thanksgiving break. I believed most problems could be managed if you paid attention early enough. That belief had kept me hopeful through 7 years of trying to have a baby. There had been specialists' injections, calendars, blood work, and 2 miscarriages I still could not talk about without feeling pressure behind my ribs. By the time I became pregnant with Ethan through our final round of IVF, I was afraid to buy baby clothes until I reached the 3rd trimester. My doctor called it a high-risk pregnancy because of my age, blood pressure, and history. I called it 9 months of holding my breath. Brian knew all of that. The afternoon before I went into labor, he had stood beside me in the nursery with his hand spread over my stomach. He asked me to smile while he took a picture for Facebook. 10 minutes later, he posted it with the caption, "Can't wait to meet our little man." The comments came quickly. "You two will be amazing parents. Brian is going to be such a great dad. What a beautiful family." Then he put down his phone, looked at the nursing chair I had ordered, and said, "Did we really need the expensive one?" It was on sale. It was still almost $400. "My back has been hurting." He shook his head. "You know, not everything has to be top of the line just because we waited a long time." That was Brian. Warm in photographs, irritated in private. I had noticed the change during the pregnancy, but I kept explaining it away. He was under pressure at work. He was nervous about becoming a father at 46. He had never been good with hospitals. I was very skilled at finding reasonable explanations for unreasonable behavior. At 2:19 that morning, I called 911 from the hallway. The dispatcher asked if my husband was home. I looked toward the bedroom. "Yes." "Is he able to drive you?" "No," I said. "He has work in the morning." There was a pause. Not a long one. Just enough for me to hear how that sounded to another person. The dispatcher told me to sit down and unlock the front door. I changed into gray sweatpants and an old Carmel Clay Schools sweatshirt. Lifting my hospital bag felt harder than it should have. Halfway down the stairs, I had to stop and breathe through another contraction. When I opened the front door, Rosa Delgado was already crossing the street. Rosa was 68, widowed, and lived in the brick ranch directly across from us. She had arthritis in both knees and usually moved slowly, especially before sunrise. That morning, she moved fast. "Claire," she called. "What happened?" "The baby's coming." She looked behind me. "Where's Brian?" I could not answer right away. Her expression changed. "He's upstairs." Rosa stared at our bedroom window. The curtains were open a few inches. Then she came closer and took the hospital bag from my hand. "All right," she said. "Lean on me." "Rosa, your knees." "My knees have complained for 15 years. They can complain at the hospital." The ambulance arrived 2 minutes later. As the paramedics helped me onto the stretcher, Rosa climbed in beside me without asking permission. She had forgotten her purse and was wearing bedroom slippers, but she held my hand all the way to IU Health North. Ethan's heart rate dropped about 3 hours into labor. 1 minute, a nurse was adjusting my monitor. The next, the room filled with people. Someone said, "We need to move." Someone else asked me to sign a form. I remember the bright operating room lights, the blood pressure cuff tightening around my arm, and Rosa's face disappearing behind the closing doors. Brian still had not answered my calls. Ethan was delivered by emergency C-section at 6:41 a.m. He weighed 6 pounds, 8 ounces. When they lifted him high enough for me to see him, he was red-faced and furious, with a full head of dark hair. His cry was thin at first, then strong. "That's your boy," one of the nurses said. I started laughing and crying at the same time. The surgery took longer than expected because I lost more blood than they wanted. By the time they brought me to recovery, I was shaking under 2 heated blankets. Rosa was waiting in a plastic chair with my phone in her lap. "Any word from Brian?" I asked. She looked down. "No, honey." At 12:47 that afternoon, he finally sent a text. "Did everything go okay?" That was it. No call. No request to speak to a doctor. No question about Ethan's weight, my surgery, or which room we were in. Just 6 words. A maternity nurse named Denise noticed me staring at the screen. She was probably in her late 50s, with silver mixed into her brown hair and reading glasses hanging from a cord around her neck. She adjusted Ethan's blanket and said, "I've worked nights for 32 years. People always find a reason not to come." I looked at her. She nodded toward Rosa, who had fallen asleep with one hand resting on her swollen knee. But the person in that bed never forgets who showed up. I looked down at Ethan. His whole hand was wrapped around the tip of my finger. For years I had been afraid of losing my chance to become a mother. That morning, I realized I had been so focused on keeping my marriage together that I had not noticed Brian had already stepped out of it. 1 week later, I came home with Ethan. Brian had spent most of those 7 days saying he was too busy to visit. That afternoon, he knocked on the locked bedroom door. "My mother keeps asking for pictures," he said. "I want to see my son." I opened the door a few inches and looked him straight in the eye. "What son?" I asked. Brian stared at me through the narrow opening as if I had spoken in another language. "What do you mean, what son?" I kept one hand on the door. "You mean Ethan?" His jaw tightened. "Yes, Claire, Ethan, my son. The baby you left me to deliver while you slept?" For a second, neither of us said anything. I could hear the soft mechanical hum of the bassinet behind me. Rosa was sitting in the rocking chair near the window, folding a receiving blanket across her lap. She did not look up, but I knew she was listening. Brian lowered his voice. "You're being ridiculous. I had surgery." "I know that." "You didn't visit." "I had work." "You didn't call." "I texted you." 6 words. He said it like that settled the matter. Then he glanced over my shoulder. "Can I come in or not?" I almost laughed. Not because anything was funny, because he had arrived wearing a navy suit, polished shoes, and the expression of a man stopping by to inspect a delivery. There was no hospital bracelet on his wrist, no exhaustion under his eyes, no trace that the previous week had changed him at all. "Why are you here now?" I asked. He shifted his weight. "My mother keeps asking for pictures. People at work have been asking too." There it was. Not I missed him. Not how are you feeling? Pictures. Rosa stopped folding the blanket. Brian noticed her and frowned. "Why is she here?" "She came to the hospital with me. I mean now." "She's helping." "I'm capable of helping." Rosa looked up then. "You had 7 days to demonstrate that." Brian's face turned red. "This is a family matter." Rosa smiled without warmth. "It became my business when your wife left this house in an ambulance while you stayed upstairs." I expected Brian to snap at her. Instead, he looked embarrassed. That told me something too. He still cared how he appeared in front of other people. I opened the door wider, but I did not step aside immediately. "You can come in for 10 minutes, I said. "Wash your hands first." He gave me a look. "I know how to hold a baby." "I didn't say you didn't." He washed his hands in the hall bathroom, then walked into the bedroom and stood beside the bassinet. Ethan was asleep in a pale green sleeper with tiny bears printed across the chest, his mouth opened and closed in little sucking motions. Brian stared down at him. "He's small. He was born 3 weeks early. I thought he was full term. You would know more if you had come to the hospital." He ignored that. When I lifted Ethan and placed him in Brian's arms, Brian held him too far from his chest, like a fragile package he was afraid of dropping. "Support his head," I said. "I am." "You're supporting his neck." Brian adjusted his hand, irritated already. Ethan made a small squeaking sound and scrunched his face. Brian looked alarmed. "Does he always do that?" "He's 7 days old, Brian." Rosa turned her face toward the window, but I saw her shoulders move. Brian pulled out his phone. He took several pictures. In most of them, he angled the screen so his own face filled half the frame. "Can you take one of us?" he asked me. "No." He looked at Rosa. She shook her head. "I don't work for Facebook." Brian took a selfie instead. The moment Ethan began fussing, he held him out toward me. "I think he's hungry." "He ate 20 minutes ago." "Well, something's wrong." I took Ethan back. Nothing was wrong. He settled as soon as I placed him against my chest. Brian checked his watch. "I have dinner with the regional team tonight." "Of course you do." He paused at the doorway. "You need to stop punishing me for one bad decision." I looked down at Ethan. One bad decision lasted 7 days. That night, while I was warming a bottle in the kitchen, my phone buzzed. Brian had posted the selfie. My whole world finally arrived. There were more than 200 likes within an hour. His mother commented, "Proud of my wonderful son." A coworker wrote, "Natural-born dad." I turned the phone face down. My actual world was less polished. My incision burned every time I stood up. My ankles were still swollen. I slept in stretches so short I stopped counting them. Sometimes Ethan would cry just as I had lowered myself carefully onto the couch, and I would have to push back up with both hands while trying not to pull at the stitches. One night, around 3, I sat on the bathroom floor and cried because I could not remember whether I had taken my pain medication. Not dramatic crying, just silent tears falling onto my sweatshirt while the bottle warmer clicked off in the kitchen. Rosa helped whenever she could. Her hands hurt in the mornings, and her knees made climbing our front steps difficult, but she came anyway. She brought chicken soup, washed bottles, and sat beside Ethan's bassinet while I showered. She could not hold him for long, so she rested one hand near his feet and talked to him softly. My mother, Evelyn, called twice a day from Dayton. She was 73 and recovering from hip replacement surgery. "I can come," she kept saying. "You can barely get from the bedroom to the kitchen." "I have a walker." "That is not an argument in your favor." She sighed. "I hate that you're doing this without me." "I'm not without you." But sometimes, after we hung up, I would look at Ethan and do the math. I would be almost 63 when he graduated from high school. That thought scared me more than I wanted to admit. What if my back got worse? What if my blood pressure did? What if I was trying to keep up with a teenager while everyone else assumed I was his grandmother? Brian never asked those questions. He came home late, left early, and acted as if every request involving Ethan was an interruption. One evening I tried ordering formula and my prescription refill through CVS. The card was declined. I tried again. Same result. When I called Brian, he said it was probably a bank error. "Use another card." That was our household card. "I'll look at it tomorrow." I did not wait. I logged into our accounts after Ethan fell asleep. The credit card was nearly maxed out. There were restaurant charges in Chicago, Nashville, and downtown Indianapolis, 2 hotel stays, a jewelry store purchase 3 days before Ethan was born. At first, I thought someone had stolen the card number. Then I noticed the date. Brian had told me he was in Louisville on one of those weekends. The hotel charge was in Chicago. I opened a spreadsheet. That was what I knew how to do: sort, compare, look for what did not belong. Date, location, amount. Brian's explanation. By midnight, I had 3 months of transactions lined up. At 12:18, the old family iPad lit up on the counter. A message appeared from someone named Kendra Shaw. Once the baby comes, Claire will be too exhausted to notice anything. My hands went cold. The iPad was still connected to an Apple account Brian must have forgotten about. I opened the message thread. There were hotel confirmations, photos of jewelry, complaints about me. Then I found the one that changed everything. She won't leave now. She worked too hard to get pregnant. I read it twice. Brian had not only betrayed me, he had counted on motherhood trapping me. I waited until Ethan was asleep, closed myself inside the laundry room, and called Margaret Sullivan. When she asked what I wanted, my voice shook. I don't want a war, I said. I want to make sure my son never learns that love means accepting whatever someone does to you. Margaret Sullivan's office sat in a quiet brick building just north of downtown Indianapolis, across from a coffee shop that always smelled like cinnamon rolls. I arrived 20 minutes early because Ethan had fallen asleep in the car, and I knew better than to interrupt one of the rare naps he gave me. I sat there watching people come and go with briefcases and travel mugs while my son slept in the back seat. A month earlier, I had imagined this stage of my life very differently. I thought I would be worrying about daycare, first smiles, and which grandparents would spoil Ethan the most. Instead, I was carrying a diaper bag in one hand and a 3-inch binder of bank statements in the other. Margaret greeted me herself. She was 59, with silver hair cut just below her chin and the calm voice of someone who had seen every version of a marriage ending. "You must be Claire." "I am." "And this young man must be Ethan." She smiled at him before leading us into her office. The room wasn't intimidating. No towering shelves of law books. No dramatic mahogany furniture. Just family photographs, neatly organized files, and a small rocking chair tucked into one corner. "I've represented a lot of new mothers," she said as I settled Ethan into the chair. "You're welcome to stop whenever he needs you." That simple sentence nearly made me cry. She didn't treat Ethan like an inconvenience. Brian had been doing that for months. Margaret waited until I finished explaining everything. The labor. The hospital. The affair. The hidden expenses. The messages. The spreadsheet. She flipped through my binder slowly. "You've organized this very well." "I'm a librarian." "I can tell." She smiled briefly. Then she became serious. "Claire, I need to separate two things." I nodded. "One is what Brian did as a husband. The other is what the court cares about." I leaned forward. "They're different?" "Sometimes very different." She explained that Indiana was a no-fault divorce state. Brian would not lose custody simply because he cheated. The judge would not punish him for sleeping with another woman. That wasn't how family court worked. What mattered was evidence. How involved each parent actually was. How marital money had been spent. Whether either parent placed the child at risk. Whether someone tried hiding assets. "It isn't satisfying," Margaret admitted. "But it is predictable." That word stayed with me. Predictable. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I wasn't walking through fog. Margaret made something else very clear. "You cannot use Ethan as revenge." "I don't want to." "I believe you." She folded her hands. "But judges see frightened parents make emotional decisions every day. If Brian asks to visit, be reasonable. If he wants photographs, reasonable. If he wants overnight visits with a newborn." She shook her head. "Not yet. Everything should have a reason related to Ethan. Not Brian." I appreciated that. She wasn't teaching me how to win. She was teaching me how to stay credible. Over the next 2 weeks, we filed for divorce. Margaret requested temporary primary physical custody because Ethan was still a newborn and breastfeeding. She proposed short, frequent visits instead of long overnight stays. She also filed paperwork asking the court to prevent either of us from moving large amounts of money until financial records could be reviewed. Nothing dramatic. Nothing theatrical. Just careful steps. Meanwhile, life at home became harder than I expected. People imagine revenge feels exciting. It doesn't. Most mornings I couldn't remember whether I'd brushed my teeth. I lived in 2-hour cycles. Feed Ethan. Burp Ethan. Change Ethan. Pump milk. Wash bottles. Try to sleep. Repeat. Some afternoons I sat on the living room floor because standing hurt too much after the C-section. I would look at the nursery we had painted together and wonder whether I had failed somehow. Maybe I should have noticed sooner. Maybe I should have asked harder questions. Maybe. Then Ethan would yawn, or wrap his tiny fingers around mine. And I would remember that this wasn't about saving a marriage anymore. It was about building a healthier life for him. Brian received the divorce papers on a Thursday afternoon. He called within 15 minutes. "You actually hired a lawyer?" "Yes." "This is unbelievable." "I agree. You never even gave me a chance." I almost laughed. "I gave you 7 years. No. I mean recently." He showed up that evening carrying grocery bags. Fresh fruit. Soup. Diapers. Formula. If someone had walked in at that moment, they would have believed he was husband of the year. "I thought we could have dinner," he said. I looked at the bags. "You've never bought groceries before." "I can change." "So suddenly." He ignored that. Instead, he picked up Ethan. He kissed the top of his head. Then he looked at me. "We don't have to rush this divorce." I stayed quiet. "My annual bonus gets paid in 3 months. It'll help all of us." There it was. Not our marriage. Not Ethan. Money. We can separate after bonus season. I asked one question. "Is Kendra included in that plan?" His face changed so quickly it almost made me feel sorry for him. Almost. "I don't know what you're talking about." I walked into the kitchen and returned with printed screenshots. He recognized them immediately. "How did you get those?" "You forgot about the iPad." He grabbed the papers. "This is private." "So was my labor." He opened his mouth. Closed it. Opened it again. "Claire, I love you. I made mistakes. It didn't mean anything." I looked at him for several seconds. Then I asked quietly, "Which part didn't mean anything? The hotels? The jewelry? Or telling another woman I'd be too exhausted to notice?" He rubbed both hands across his forehead. "You were different. I was pregnant. You were emotional. I was carrying your son. You stopped caring about us." I felt something inside me become strangely calm. "No," I said. "I stopped being convenient." He stared at me. Then he tried another direction. "We should stay married until the bonus comes. Think about Ethan." "I am. If we lose that money..." "We already did." He frowned. "What?" "You spent it." He had no answer. After he left, I added another page to my binder. Date. Time. Conversation summary. Exact phrases. Margaret had told me to document facts, not feelings. 3 days later, I found something I hadn't noticed before. Several hotel charges matched reimbursement deposits from Brian's employer. I looked more closely. A luxury dinner had been categorized as a physician appreciation meal. A bracelet purchased for Kendra had been listed as a client gift. A weekend resort stay appeared beside something called a regional development conference. I wasn't an accountant, but I knew enough to recognize numbers that didn't belong together. I brought everything to Margaret. She studied the documents for nearly 10 minutes. Finally, she looked up. "You are not sending these to his employer." "I wasn't planning to." "Good. What happens now?" "We request complete financial disclosure. And, if these records are genuine, the company may eventually discover the discrepancies themselves." A week later, Brian panicked. Without warning, he transferred several $1,000s out of our savings account. He canceled one of our shared credit cards. The checking account we used for groceries suddenly held less than $200. I sat at my kitchen table that night trying to figure out how to pay both my lawyer and daycare deposits. For the first time since Ethan was born, I felt afraid of something other than Brian. Money. Real money. I sold my grandmother's pearl bracelet, the one she had worn every Easter. I cried in the parking lot afterward. Not because of the bracelet. Because I understood that surviving this divorce would cost me things I loved too. 2 days later, my phone rang. "Margaret. They've opened an internal investigation." "Who has?" "Brian's company." I stopped rocking Ethan. "What happened?" "It appears the financial documents produced during discovery raised some questions. She paused. Then she said quietly, "Claire, you weren't the only person Brian believed was too tired to check his receipts. By the time our temporary custody hearing arrived, Ethan was almost 5 months old. He had discovered his own hands, laughed whenever Rosa sang old ranchera songs to him, and somehow managed to drool through 3 bibs before lunchtime. Life had settled into a rhythm that wasn't easy, but it was ours. I was back at the library 3 days a week. Rosa watched Ethan on Tuesdays and Thursdays. My mother, Evelyn, came over every other weekend from Dayton whenever her hip allowed the drive. Some mornings I still woke up expecting to hear Brian getting ready for work. Then I remembered that the house was quiet for a reason. Margaret had warned me not to expect family court to feel like television. "No surprise witnesses," she had said. "No dramatic speeches. Judges want facts, not performances." She was right. The biggest surprises happened outside the courtroom. A week before the hearing, Brian showed up at my apartment without calling. It was just after 6 in the evening. I had finished feeding Ethan mashed sweet potatoes for the first time, and orange smears covered both of his cheeks. Someone knocked hard enough to rattle the door. When I looked through the peephole, Brian was standing there with a stuffed giraffe tucked under one arm. I opened the door but stayed inside. "What are you doing here?" "I came to take Ethan." "You have a visit Saturday." "I know. I want extra time." "That isn't how this works." His smile disappeared. "You don't get to make all the rules." "I didn't. The court proposed a schedule. I haven't agreed to it." "No," I said, "you ignored it." He tried to step forward. "I'll only be gone a couple of hours." "Where's the car seat?" He blinked. "What?" "You drove here." "Yes." "Where's Ethan's car seat?" Brian looked toward the parking lot. "I figured I'd use yours." I almost couldn't believe what I was hearing. "You can't just move an infant from one car seat to another every time it's convenient." "It's not a big deal." "It is when you're transporting a 5-month-old?" He sighed dramatically. "You always have to make everything complicated." "No, Brian, children are complicated." He became louder. "You're keeping my son from me. I've never stopped you from visiting him. You've stopped me from controlling the visits." Those were 2 very different things. He took out his phone. "If you won't cooperate, I'll call the police." "Go ahead." He looked surprised that I hadn't panicked. 10 minutes later, 2 Carmel police officers arrived. One was probably in his late 20s. The other looked closer to retirement. Both listened carefully while Brian explained that his wife was refusing to let him see his son. The older officer turned toward me. "Ma'am?" I invited them inside. Margaret had prepared me for this possibility. Everything was already organized in a blue accordion folder on my kitchen counter. Temporary parenting proposal. Court filings. Ethan's pediatric appointments. Copies of every scheduled visit Brian had either canceled or shortened. The older officer reviewed the paperwork. Then he looked at Brian. "Sir, this appears to be a family court matter." "She's hiding my son." The officer glanced toward Ethan, who was happily chewing on a rubber teething ring in his playpen. "He doesn't appear hidden." Brian flushed. "She's making it impossible for me to be a father." The younger officer asked politely, "Who's Ethan's pediatrician?" Brian hesitated. "I don't remember his name." "What clinic?" Silence. "What formula is he drinking?" More silence. At that moment, Rosa walked through the connecting door between our apartments, carrying a casserole dish. She stopped when she saw the officers. "Everything all right?" The older officer smiled politely. "We're sorting something out." Rosa looked at Brian. "He finally remembered he has a child?" Brian snapped. "Stay out of this." She ignored him. Then she looked at the officer. "I know what time that baby naps, what size diapers he wears, and which stuffed rabbit he sleeps with." She nodded toward Brian. "I've never once seen him carry a diaper bag." Neither officer laughed. They didn't need to. The silence was uncomfortable enough. The older officer handed Brian back his paperwork. "You'll need to continue this through family court." After they left, Brian glared at me. "You planned this?" "No, I prepared for it." The hearing took place 8 days later in Hamilton County. Brian arrived wearing an expensive charcoal suit that looked newer than anything he'd bought during our marriage. His mother, Patricia, sat behind him. So did Kendra. Seeing her there surprised me. She looked uncomfortable, avoiding eye contact with almost everyone. Margaret simply leaned toward me. Stay focused. The judge began with temporary custody. Brian's attorney argued first. He described Brian as a hard-working father whose demanding career had temporarily limited his availability after Ethan's birth. He suggested I had become emotionally unstable after childbirth and was unfairly restricting Brian's relationship with our son. I wanted to interrupt. Margaret gently touched my arm. Not yet. When it was our turn, she stood without raising her voice. She introduced one document after another. The 911 call placed at 2:17 a.m. The ambulance report. Hospital visitor records showing Brian never arrived. His text message asking whether everything had gone okay. The record showing his first visit occurred 7 days after Ethan's birth. My daily caregiving journal. Pediatric appointment records. Breastfeeding consultations. Canceled visits. Financial statements. None of it sounded dramatic. Each piece alone was small. Together they formed a story. Then Rosa testified. Brian's attorney smiled politely. Mrs. Delgado, are you absolutely certain Mr. Morgan remained inside the house while the ambulance was there? Rosa folded her hands. I heard him snoring through the upstairs window while the paramedics carried Claire down the front steps. The courtroom became very quiet. Brian stared down at the table. When he testified, he insisted he believed everything was under control. I thought Claire wanted space. Margaret asked one simple question. If you believed your wife and newborn were safe, why did it take 7 days before you visited them? Brian hesitated. I had work obligations. No further questions. Sometimes one unanswered question weighs more than 20 accusations. During a short recess, Brian's phone rang. He stepped into the hallway. When he returned 5 minutes later, his face had completely changed. Even Patricia noticed. What happened? He shook his head. Nothing. But it wasn't nothing. When the hearing ended, Margaret quietly told me she had received confirmation from Brian's attorney. Brian's employer had completed its internal audit. Several expense reports had been determined to contain false business justifications. Hotel stays, restaurant bills, gifts, mileage reimbursements. His company vehicle, corporate credit card, and management responsibilities were suspended immediately pending final termination procedures. Kendra stood up slowly. She looked at Brian for several seconds. Then she picked up her purse and walked out of the courtroom without saying a word. Patricia remained seated. She looked older than I remembered. Finally, she asked her son one question. Did you really use company money? Brian didn't answer. That silence told her everything. The judge returned with a temporary order. Primary physical custody would remain with me while Ethan was still an infant. Brian would receive shorter, structured parenting visits that could expand if he remained consistent. Both of us would communicate through a parenting app. Neither of us could transfer significant marital assets without approval. Brian was ordered to complete infant care and co-parenting classes before requesting overnight visits. Nobody clapped. Nobody celebrated. Real justice rarely sounds dramatic. Outside the courthouse, Brian caught up with me before I reached the parking garage. You ruined everything. I looked at him for a long moment. I never filed a single false expense report. You turned my company against me. I handed my lawyer the truth. He shook his head. You wanted revenge. I adjusted Ethan's blanket inside his stroller. No. I wanted my son to grow up knowing that actions have consequences. Rosa slipped her arm through mine as we walked away. For years, Brian had mistaken my patience for weakness. That afternoon, he finally learned the difference. The divorce became final just over 8 months after Ethan was born. If you've never been through a divorce, you might imagine the judge bangs a gavel, signs a few papers, and suddenly your life begins again. It doesn't work that way. Life keeps asking for ordinary things while you're still carrying extraordinary hurt. The washing machine still breaks. The baby still wakes up at 2 o'clock in the morning because he's cutting another tooth. Bills still arrive. And eventually you discover that healing doesn't happen all at once. It happens in tiny moments you almost miss. By then, Brian had officially lost his management position. The company's internal audit confirmed that he had submitted dozens of improper expense reports over nearly 2 years. Some were careless mistakes. Others had clearly been intentional. He wasn't led away in handcuffs. Real life is rarely that dramatic. Instead, he lost something that mattered even more to him: his reputation. The regional sales director everyone admired became another former employee quietly looking for work. After several months, he found a new sales job with a much smaller medical supply company in Fishers. Lower salary. No company car. No management team. No expense account. He was required to repay part of the money the company determined had been improperly reimbursed. It wasn't the kind of punishment that makes newspaper headlines. It was the kind that followed him every time he filled out a job application. People sometimes ask whether that felt satisfying. Not the way they expect. Watching someone lose everything isn't nearly as exciting when you once loved them enough to build a future together. I wasn't celebrating. I was simply relieved that I no longer had to carry the weight of protecting his lies. My own life wasn't magically easier. Selling my SUV had become unavoidable. Between attorney's fees, daycare costs, and the months Brian had emptied our accounts, I needed something with lower payments. I traded it for a used Honda Civic with nearly 90,000 miles on it. The first morning I dropped Ethan off at daycare before driving to Town Meadow Elementary, I cried the entire way to work. Not because I didn't trust the teachers. Because I hated leaving him before he could even tell me how his day had been. When I unlocked the library that morning, the familiar smell of books wrapped around me like an old friend. Children began arriving before the first bell. "Mrs. Morgan! I found another dinosaur book. Can you help me find the Magic Treehouse series?" Their excitement reminded me that life keeps growing, even after it's been broken. At home, things slowly became steadier. My mother finally recovered enough from her hip replacement to visit more often. She still walked with a cane and couldn't carry Ethan for very long, but she insisted on folding laundry, chopping vegetables, and reading picture books while he crawled across the living room rug. One afternoon, I apologized. "I'm supposed to be taking care of you." She laughed. "Says who? You just had hip surgery. And you just survived childbirth, surgery, and a divorce." She reached over and squeezed my hand. "Getting older doesn't mean we stop helping each other. It just means we help a little slower." Across the street, Rosa remained Ethan's favorite person besides me. Her arthritis had become worse that winter. She couldn't sit on the floor anymore, so Ethan crawled to her instead. She kept crackers in one pocket and tiny board books in the other. Whenever he toddled toward her, she would grin and say, "There's my little library assistant." The title always made me smile. Family had become something very different from what I once imagined. It wasn't defined by last names or wedding rings. It was built one dependable day at a time. Brian surprised me too. Not immediately. The first several parenting visits were awkward. He forgot extra diapers. He packed bottles without warming instructions. Once he drove halfway home before realizing Ethan's favorite blanket was still at my house. But something slowly changed. The infant care class the court required seemed to humble him. Instead of pretending he already knew everything, he began asking questions. "What does this rash look like? How long should I warm the bottle? Does he always rub his left ear when he's tired?" For the first time, those questions weren't about looking like a good father. They were about becoming one. Trust didn't return. That wasn't possible. But hostility slowly gave way to clear boundaries. We communicated through the parenting app. We stayed focused on Ethan. Nothing more. Nothing less. On Ethan's first birthday, I reserved the children's community room at the Carmel Clay Public Library. It felt appropriate. Books had carried me through every stage of my life. Now they surrounded my son's first celebration. There were balloons shaped like storybook animals, a Costco sheet cake, juice boxes for the toddlers, and coffee for the adults trying to keep up with them. Most of the guests were people who had quietly carried us through that difficult year. My coworkers. Several parents I'd met through a support group for older first-time mothers. My mother, Rosa. Even Denise, the maternity nurse from IU Health North, stopped by for 15 minutes after finishing a night shift. She had remembered the invitation I'd mailed months earlier. When she saw Ethan trying to chase bubbles across the carpet, she smiled. I knew he'd be stubborn. He gets that from both sides, I said. Brian arrived exactly on time. Not early. Not late. He carried a small paper gift bag. Inside was a wooden shape sorter. Nothing expensive. Nothing flashy. Just something Ethan would actually enjoy. During the party, Ethan reached for Brian several times without hesitation. I watched Brian kneel beside him, patiently helping him fit the square block into the correct opening. No cameras. No selfies. No audience except the people who mattered. After everyone began cleaning up, Brian asked quietly, "Could we talk for a minute?" We stepped into the hallway, outside the children's room. He looked older than he had a year earlier. Not because of gray hair. Because regret has a way of changing a person's face. I've rehearsed this conversation 100 times, he said. I still don't know how to say it. I waited. I'm sorry. He swallowed hard. I wasn't tired that night. I was selfish. I convinced myself work mattered more. I kept believing there would always be another chance to fix it. He looked down. I missed the most important day of my son's life. I thought about answering quickly. Instead, I let the silence sit between us. Finally, I said, I don't spend my days hating you anymore. He nodded slowly. But the woman who begged you to wake up that night... I paused. She doesn't exist anymore. A tear slipped down his cheek. I know. I don't expect things to go back. They can't. No, they can't. He looked through the glass window into the party room. Ethan was sitting on Rosa's lap while my mother held open a picture book. 3 generations. None of them connected by blood. All connected by love. I almost lost all of this, Brian whispered. You did lose part of it. He nodded again. Then he thanked me for letting him be part of Ethan's life. There was nothing else to say. That night, after everyone had gone home and Ethan was finally asleep, I stood in his doorway for a long time. A year earlier, I believed love was measured by promises. Now I know it's measured by presence. By the people who answer the phone before dawn. The ones who drive across town after surgery. The neighbor who crosses the street on aching knees because she sees someone who shouldn't have to be alone. Brian spent a long time learning that lesson. So did I. If this story reminds you of someone who quietly stood beside you during the hardest season of your life, I hope you tell them while you still can. Those ordinary acts of kindness often become the memories that carry us the farthest. And if you've ever had to rebuild your life one small step at a time, I'd love to hear your story too.